I am going to talk about consumption tax, which you are seeing almost every day. Also, let us learn how to calculate consumption tax levied on exporting articles, or precautionary advices on using duty-free shops in Japan. Consumption tax is levied on almost every consumption activity, all articles and services sold or provided in Japan. Consumers will bear a burden of consumption tax payment, though businesses at each step of transaction have an obligation of its declaration and payment. Consumption tax establishes two rates. One is called standard tax, which is 10%, and the other is a deducted tax, 8%. Consumption tax is included in the price of the article or service sold or provided by each step of transaction, then consequently the final consumer of the article or service will bear a burden of payment. Let us take stuffed toy transaction as an example to see how consumption tax goes. Before start making a stuffed toy, manufacturer buys materials such as wool yarn from a material dealer. Then, knitted stuffed toy will be sold from the manufacturer to a retailer, then from the retailer to a consumer. Calculation shows that consumption tax is finally borne by a consumer, though each business must make declaration and payment of it at each step of transaction. As you can see, this manufacturer bought wool yarn from the material dealer and paid 7,700 yen for it. Then, the manufacturer costs this 700 yen of consumption tax into the selling price to a retailer. Retailer also costs 1,000 yen of consumption tax into the selling price of the product to a consumer. In this way, a consumer finally bears a burden of paying 1,300 yen of consumption tax. In this chart, for example, the retailer received 1,300 yen as consumption tax from a consumer. The amount of 300 yen after deduction of 1,000 yen of consumption tax which the retailer already paid to the manufacturer is all the retailer has to borne. This is how consumption tax goes round. However, not every business has the obligation to declare it. Small-scale business owners are exempted from making consumption tax declaration. Well, let us proceed to the next page to see what kind of business owners need to declare and pay consumption tax. Businesses that require consumption tax declaration and its payment are called taxable business. On the other hand, businesses exempted from these obligations are called tax-exempted business. Then, what factor decides whether you will be categorized as taxable business or tax-exempted business? Basic factor is the categorization by taxable sales figures during the base period. Taxable sales is the sales figures before consumption tax is levied. Note that this taxable sales includes sales figures from export transactions. Base period means a year before the last of declaration if your business is an unincorporated business, and the fiscal year before the last if your business is an incorporated business. If your business's annual taxable sales during the base period exceeds 10 million yen, your business will be categorized as taxable business for that year. In case your business's year before the last's taxable sales did not reach 10 million yen, the business will be categorized as tax-exempted business. However, you can choose to be registered as taxable business upon the registration for it. Like this, taxable sales figure during the base period determines which category your business is in. Calculation shows that consumption tax is finally borne by a consumer, though each business must make declaration and payment of it at each step of transaction. Here shows how the calculation of consumption tax the business must declare and pay goes. Deducts the amount of consumption tax paid for necessary expenses or purchases for materials from the amount of consumption tax imposed on selling price. That leaves the amount of consumption tax you are obliged to pay. Consumption tax exemption from purchase is a necessary procedure to calculate the amount of consumption tax you need to pay. All you have to do is to deduct the paid amount of consumption tax on the materials from the amount of consumption tax on the selling price. However, there is a rule to be admitted this tax exemption for purchases. That is, keeping of bills and account book becomes indispensable. Please look at the screen. Under the new invoice reporting system, bills you are required to keep under the current system will be replaced by invoice. Invoice is supposed to be issued by registered invoice issuing business who are categorized as taxable businesses. As for invoice issuing businesses, I will explain it in the following pages. Normally, consumption tax is levied on every domestic transactions done by businesses. However, in case of exporting articles or services abroad, consumption tax on them will be exempted. This is from the idea that consumption tax is basically imposed on domestic consumption, therefore shall not be imposed on articles and services consumed overseas. Examples of export transactions are listed on this page. To be export tax exempted, you are required to prepare certain certificates such as export permit, or others for each itemized transaction to prove the export transaction consists of the transfer of articles or services abroad. When tourists from abroad purchase souvenirs at licensed shops for articles of export, also known as duty-free shops in Japan, by following the normal procedure, consumption tax on them will be exempted. This is called as licensed shop system for articles of export. Articles purchased at duty-free shops must be taken out with you when you leave Japan, because the tax exemption is applied on the idea that the articles are supposed to be exported and consumed abroad. However, these days, foreign residents in Japan purchase articles at those shops and resell them to the third parties by accepting orders via SNS. If you transfer or consume the consumption tax exempted article purchased in Japan before you leave Japan, the consumption tax of that article you obliged to pay at the time of purchase will be charged, or be given imprisonment of up to a year or fine up for 500,000 yen. So, we should warn you to take great care not to be easily involved in these illegal consumption tax exempted article purchasing businesses with the aim of reselling or transferring to the third party. Articles you purchased at duty-free shops must be taken out abroad by yourself. Consumption tax exempted articles are sold to tourists as souvenirs of Japan. Business purpose, selling purpose, reselling purpose, as well as any purchase on behalf of the third person is strictly prohibited. If you failed to show purchased consumption tax exempted articles at the time of leaving Japan, the customs office will charge you the amount you are obliged to pay. Please note that in case you transferred the purchased consumption tax exempted articles before leaving Japan, you will be given penalty of imprisonment of up to a year, or fine up to 500,000 yen. Under this system, keeping of eligible invoice, or is called invoice, is required for consumption tax exemption for purchase. I am going to point out 3 important things about this invoice reporting system. First, the invoice reporting system starts at 1st of October, 2023. Second, seller issues invoice to its purchaser. Note that the seller must be registered as an invoice issuing business. Once registered, the seller needs to declare consumption tax as a taxable business. Third, the purchaser from the transaction above needs to keep an invoice issued by the seller. The purchaser can declare tax exemption for purchases referring to this invoice. In other words, if you do not have an invoice, then you cannot declare tax exemption for purchases. The amount of purchase cannot be considered when you figuring out the amount of tax you have to pay. To be qualified to issue invoice, the business needs to register as an invoice issuing business. Then, what happens at a transaction with a business with no qualification of issuing invoice? Let us take an example of a stuffed toy transaction. Manufacturer purchases wool yarn from a handicraft shop to make a stuffed toy. Then, the manufacturer A sells this stuffed toy to retailer B, who sells the stuffed toy to a consumer. When the manufacturer A is not registered as an invoice issuing business, what does retailer B have to do in figuring out the amount of consumption tax obliged to pay? Retailer B needs to take consumption tax exemption for purchases into its tax report. In this stuffed toy transaction, retailer B wants to deduct consumption tax from its purchase from manufacturer A. You need to keep invoice for each transaction to obtain consumption tax exemption for purchases. In this case, the retailer B needs invoice issued by manufacturer A to claim consumption tax exemption for purchases. However, if manufacturer A is not an invoice registered business, manufacturer A cannot issue invoice, therefore, Retailer B cannot claim consumption tax exemption for purchases from the manufacturer A. As a result, Retailer B will be levied 1,300 yen of consumption tax on its transaction. In this case, Retailer B needs to pay 1,000 yen more than the one it has to pay with an invoice issuing business. As you can see, if a seller is not registered as an invoice issuing business, the purchaser from that business requires to pay larger amount of consumption tax comparing to the transaction with an invoice issuing registered business. Thank you for learning consumption tax system, which you are seeing almost every day.